Welcome everybody to the presentation and discussion of the Committee for Sydney's Global Benchmarking Report. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the committee. And let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And while our guests are in the UK, I am coming from the land of the Gadigal of the Eora. Let me pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Those of you who have been part of the committee or following the committee will know that we have been doing global benchmarking reports for a long time. In fact, if I have the committee's history correctly, the very first report the committee ever did in its after it formed was a global benchmarking report. These are important to us because we think cities need to learn from other cities. I mean, that's the essence of it. It's a beautiful part of this moment in history that it's so easy to learn from other cities, even though travel has been shut down because of COVID. We still have access in a way that is just extraordinary to understand what is happening. And so the lessons of what works and what doesn't work can be shared. Of course, that has always been true. That's an ancient, it's an ancient part of city life, that innovations from one city spread to other cities. Architectural ideas and economic ideas and technological inventions and religions have spread. But today, as cities grapple with new sets of problems and as humanity is increasingly concentrated in cities, we think that it's worth being structured about the learning at times and challenging ourselves to see who's doing a good job. And so the benchmarking report is part of that. It's one of the ways we cast the net broadly to understand how other cities are performing. For many years now, we have relied on the Business of Cities, a global consulting firm, to do the benchmarking report for us. They do this for many other clients all over the world. They really have their fingers on the pulse of cities. So the structure for today is quite simple. Tim Moonen, who's the managing director of the Business of Cities, will present some highlights from the findings. And then Greg Clark and I will be respondents and discussants. Greg is known to many of you. He's been to Sydney many times. He is the group advisor on future cities for HSBC. Thank you both for joining us. Tim, over to you.
Gabe, thank you for those kind words of introduction. Really nice to see you, and hello to everyone in Sydney and in New South Wales and beyond. And thank you to the Committee for Sydney, I guess, for, as you rightly describe, a really enduring collaboration. And this year has been no different. We thoroughly enjoyed working with you on this. And as a reminder to some of you that may not have seen this work before, and even for those of you that do, this is, in fact, as you were saying, Gabe, the 7th annual edition of this annual benchmarking report. And as you'll see on the next slide, it's really about, if we go back one, it's really about the 800 benchmarks that there are now all around the world that look at cities in different ways, from different lenses. And we pick for this work those that are most relevant, most resonant even for Sydney, 140 of them in this year's report. And as you can imagine, the idea here has always been to cast that net wide, exactly as Gabe says, and to get that full spectrum of studies to really get that picture of how Sydney's doing, firstly, how the world understands Sydney, and in what way is the world understanding and expecting things differently of cities. And of course, now is really a time for that, more than perhaps any other in these last 7 years. And so this is about perceptions of a wide range of audiences, but it's also about objective performance, mostly at that metropolitan Greater Sydney scale, but it also influenced by lots of other scales, and we will come back to that later on. It's about those short-term fluctuations, of which we've seen a lot in the last 18 months to 2 years, but also those things that are influenced by long-run, cumulative and continuous investments and interventions. And I think also it's about the understanding that this is a relative assessment. It's about Sydney against and compared to a really established and consistent peer group of high-performing cities, most of whom, if not all of them, are experiencing high levels of growth and spatial change. And I think there are questions all of the time in these cities about how they diversify. And in a way, there is a thing to recognize here that Sydney can improve, but if other cities are improving more quickly, it can fall back relative to that peer group. And the same, of course, is true in vice versa. So those are the principles of how we work and how this work always unfolds every year. And you can imagine that if we look ahead, that the work this year has been very much influenced by COVID-19. And of course, now it's this year, even more than last year, that the work has really reflected the way in which COVID-19, on the next slide, really influences both the benchmark outcomes, because cities are opening up at different rates and different speeds, but also different economic sectors that cities host and possess are differentially affected, as you well know. And at the same time, there's all sorts of swirling and changing perceptions of both which cities are doing this right, but also what really matters when you think about cities. And I think we are now seeing, at a more accelerated rate than any other of these 7 years, different priorities emerge right now in terms of how the world looks at, sees, compares, judges cities. And I think this all points to a phase of globalization that we are probably entering, that is starting to recognize that the resilience of cities is just as, if not more important, as the competitiveness of cities, that raw competition. I think it's fair to say, as we look in all the measures, that there's more choice for those who are mobile, whether it's talent or innovation or global business and capital. But there is more of a mind among those choices for the sustainability, the quality of life, the quality of place, the social fabric of the cities. And those things are really informing the range of studies that are out there that we're going to point to in a second. And if we go straight across to the latest overall results, and this is in a way the summary of summaries that looks at all of the big categories that different measures fall within, you can broadly see that Sydney's improved in 2 of these main categories. One of those areas is, of course, talent. This is because primarily the measures are recording the fact that Sydney's absorbing and retaining more of its high-skilled population in the last period of time compared to other cities. And that the main gap that remains, you can see it's performing well relative to others, is that quotient of high-level experience that it really possesses in terms of people who've at the top of their career in business and in technical skills and those domains that are really growing fast in the innovation economy. And then secondly, you'll see further down, Sydney has now recorded a shift in the trend that we'd seen over the previous years back upwards in transport and infrastructure, because of the rail investments in particular that have started to register, and that long process of catch up that we've been describing in previous years is now starting to happen when we look at all of those measures. I do think we're also noticing that the uptake of public transport and the adaptation and adoption of new and cleaner modes of transport are going to feature heavily in the future in these measures. So watch out for that. In terms of these 2 areas of decline, we can see firstly in terms of costs, in terms of business, in terms of cost for students, cost for housing, of course, and then the relative pay of top talent. In those areas, other cities are performing relatively slightly better than Sydney over this last period of time. Currency sometimes influences these scores. And perceptions, of course, also do, of renters, of students, first-time buyers, those things baked into this. And in a way, there's a perception that Sydney is becoming a systematically expensive, even unaffordable city. And then last, at the bottom there, you can see that image and brand is an area where, while Sydney has retained right the way through this period of time a resilient reputation in terms of where visitors want to go and where investment in real estate thinks there's a safe bet, actually there's also some indication in a few areas that the perceptions of business and financial professionals in particular has become marginally less favorable. So a slight slip there. So you can see that's the overall picture. Stability in the other areas, if we move to the next slide, is really, of course, a general trend looking at all of the measures. But if you look under the bonnet of those things, you can see, for example, that Sydney, because of the, I think, very rigorous approach to public health management in the last 18 months, citizen satisfaction with healthcare and safety is strong. You can see the rail infrastructure boost that's registered here. A growing improvement in Sydney is now registering some of the measures of the leading life sciences economies for the first time. And in general, although from a slower base, the ecosystem size, scale, maturity in its innovation sectors has, I think, picked up pace. And you can see performances in several social measures also, I think, being very relevant. If we go to the areas of weakness, or where perhaps Sydney is either systematically behind or is declined in recent period, air quality, I think, stands out to us, of course, because of factors that have occurred in recent years relating to bushfires, but also effects of congestion and other things. And then also there are these questions about housing affordability, renewable energy, sustainable mode share, if you like, where there's still a big gap to most of the rest of the world's leading cities. And I would also observe a potential, based on the way these things are measured and how we are tracking here, to see those trends exacerbated over the next 2 to 3 years without urgent and active interventions. Now, it's striking to us that I think that many of the areas where you see a real challenge for Sydney, and where perhaps either Sydney is doing poorly or is not improving as much as you would expect it to, given all of the other strengths and assets that we can observe, often there's a strong national influence on the components of how Sydney really performs. Of course, its sustainability stands out most of all in this, and we'll come back to that in a second. But we can also observe in the innovation and R&D measures, in some of the infrastructure measures, some of the also the labour market measures, there is certainly a trend in which national dynamics are shaping what Sydney is capable of achieving at the moment. Now, for us, this really invites the question about Sydney's relationship with Australia. It's been in the habit of all global cities, those gateway cities in leading OECD economies over the last 20 years, to really have a reciprocity of dynamic, I think, where nation states support those gateway cities, adapt to their needs, and recognize that those places that are how and where you can win mobile jobs and talent and investment, and then generate, as a result of that, tax revenues, productivity advantages, many other spillovers that the whole nation ultimately can benefit from. And I think it's been in the nature of that tacit deal between the global city and the national or federal government that the latter, I think, does need to provide that conducive environment for trade, for investment, for skills, for R&D, and of course, always reinvest in the livability platform that makes a lot of that possible. What we've seen here, and in all the measures that we observe in the report, is that the COVID-19 management and also the climate change deficit, shall we say, in Australia is really shining a spotlight on Sydney in particular, other global cities in some cases too, but in Sydney in particular right now, upon the fact that the city's performance is really, in some sense, reliant on the nation state, and in some cases can be elevated, but in more cases at the moment is being inhibited by it. And Australia now finds itself lagging on behind the OECD nations in general of course, on the climate change response. You can see the data down the bottom here in the very bottom 10, 20% of OECD nations, including some global studies or even more nations than that, as well as issues around innovation investment, around labor market flexibility, some other issues there. So there are no doubt areas where Australia's performance is lifting up Sydney's, often when it comes to those macro fundamental questions. But we do see that where those attentions of talent, but of business as well, and of capital, is turning more to how sustainable, how resilient, how well the risks are being managed in these cities, that actually with the national deficits are exposing more weaknesses, I think, for Sydney, and might hold it back from making the adjustments that we've been seeing Sydney really pursue over the last period of time. So if we think about what those implications are from all of that, from all of the studies, and I think that last observation, I think it's firstly, from our point of view, we can see that Sydney is capable and has shown itself capable of reversing a trend over multiple years and then improving on it. We see it in the transport area in particular, and continuous investment, and I think also something that's really sustained and continues that process into other areas. We'll see difference and improvement continue over time. Secondly, we see more and more emerging differences now, nearly 2 years on from the start of the pandemic, in terms of how cities not only are approaching or able to open up to the recovery, but also, and not only also in terms of that return to the office question that I think consumes many of us, but also those wider questions about whether cities can really make those temporary changes that we've seen around street space or bike lanes or certain other ways in which the public amenity is made available to people all across the city, whether they can make those things permanent, whether they can avoid what we might call a high car, low public transport nature of the recovery, whether they can join up and invest in big bets in terms of infrastructure, perhaps decarbonisation, perhaps also precinct development. These areas, I think, are where bold movers, of which Sydney should be one, are going to benefit more. That's what the data is telling us. Those unresolved issues of air pollution, as we've mentioned, and this carbon intensive growth model, increasing disadvantages across all of the metrics that we can see, affecting other areas as well as its own environmental one. And then finally, this question about how Sydney can pay attention in a sustained way to the way in which its competitiveness is shaped by Australia's, and how its prospects ultimately depend on that, and what it might mean, I think, from how that reciprocity that we observed in the previous slide can be reinvested in, how it means that more resilience to that national context can be forged in Sydney, perhaps more relationships with other big cities and smaller cities in Australia develop too, to think about that. So I think these are some of the underlying messages that we've observed this year. It's been great fun putting it all together with you, Gabe, and the rest of the team. Everyone reading this, you'll find it when it goes online, so much more in the report itself. And I think I'll hand back to Gabe now. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Tim. Tim, understanding that your voice is fading, just pipe in whenever you want. Sure. But I'll direct some questions starting out to Greg to get this conversation going. And everybody, feel free to submit questions or thoughts via the Q&A app on Zoom. So, okay, so many things to talk about here. Greg, it's clear that in the background this year, perceptions and reality about city performance are very much tied to COVID. Australia has taken a quite different approach to COVID than most of the countries it would consider peers, and so the cities that are the peer set for Sydney have really had a different experience, and it's complicated because I think it's both good and bad. It's complicated because it is continuing to evolve up to the very moment. There are different phases. The then Premier of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, one time said, "We're not going to know for 5 years who did a good job on this because there are so many phases. She said that early on in 2020, and I thought that was a very insightful comment that I've quoted many times. But with all of that as background, Greg, based on what you're seeing, who's coming out with their reputation enhanced and who's coming out with their reputation tarnished in terms of the response to COVID?
Gabe, it's a delicious question, and actually it is a little bit hard to answer, because what's becoming clear is that the post-pandemic city is beginning to emerge, but only in a kind of faltering way, because of course the pandemic is still with us. And in Europe at the moment and in North America, the discussion of this new strain and how resistant it's going to be to vaccines and whether it's more transmissible, what the long-term effects of it will be, is putting us right back into the middle of pandemic management. But I think I would make a broad point, if I may, that what seems to me to determine how cities are impacted by the virus really depends on three variables. So variable number one, I think, is the sector mix in the urban economy. If you've got sectors that are, if you've got a high percentage of employment that's in digitizable jobs, then it's occasioning a strong reaction in terms of a more distributed urbanization, more people making more choices about where they want to live versus how they want to work versus when they need to travel. So the sector mix in the urban economy is very important, and some economies don't have many digitizable jobs. So that's one thing. The second thing is obviously the degree of urbanization that already exists. So are you a mature urbanized place like Australia, New Zealand, North America, Latin America, Europe, where urbanization rates are up in 80% or more? Or are you a country that's still urbanizing? And whether it's China at sort of 70% or the Middle East at sort of 68%, or whether we're talking about, ASEAN and Africa down in the 40s or India down in the 30s, there seems to be that the countries that are still urbanizing, there's a strong return to the kind of previous urban patterns because their systems are not mature yet. Whereas in the countries like Australia, where you're more than 80% urbanized, there's more of a mature system upon which you can then make variations and you can then distribute things in a different way. So I think that's the second one. And then the third one is plain old geography, right? It's to do with the shape of the city, the degree to which people already live in the city center, or whether it's a mono-centered city that people have traditionally moved in and out of over long commutes, or whether it's a more polycentric city already, whether the suburbs are close to the city center or further away. All of these things really matter because very small behavior changes can be magnified by geography. So anyway, I think this is a general kind of approach that anytime you look at a city, you have to ask these questions. So if you look at cities that have done well, they tend to be cities where the population already lives a lot in the city center. And therefore, rather than the city center becoming a ghost town, it's simply switched towards servicing the residential population in a new way and really creating a new animation that way. Whereas cities that have not done well have tended to be ones that had long commutes before the pandemic, right? Cities that have done well tend to be ones where there isn't an over-dependence on what I might call corporate employment, but there's much more of a mix between corporate employment, creative innovation, other kinds of things. And, there's a little mantra that I say that, that the subtle changes from the virus are to get cities to be a bit less dependent on corporates, consumers, and commuters, which have all started to change their decision making, and to be more focused on habitat, being a great place to live, more focused on the experience of the city, how to make the city compete with the digital offering by making the experience unique, And then, of course, becoming a city that's much more focused on innovative activity rather than corporate services, because there's much more face-to-face requirement in that. So, so cities that have done well, of course, include cities that have these features. But generally speaking, there are a number of cities that have done well. They're listed in Tim's and your report, which I think is very interesting, particularly cities that have been able to absorb population from elsewhere. This is why cities like Miami have done well. Cities like Tel Aviv have done well because there's a strong concentration in the innovation economy. And then, you know, we could name a number of other cities, but cities like Vienna, very high quality of life, a lot of people living in the city center. So it's these kinds of things. But I think Gladys is probably right in saying it'll take a while for all of this to play out. But I do think there are reputational benefits that are already now being accrued.
Wow, Tim, Greg, fascinating answer there. It recalls something you said on one of these webinars in 2020 that really made an impression on me, that this question, how will COVID change cities, is not really just a matter of predicting how these forces will play out, but that it's actually a choice. And that the experience, the trauma of going through this, the experience of all of the various forced experiments that we are running at the level of governments and firms and households, gives us the opportunity to ask, do we want to make anything different? And, you know, cities like Paris come to mind that have utterly transformed the urban form during the last 2 years, used this as an opportunity to make, I mean, Paris has made itself a bicycling city, which it never was. And I'm so excited to see it whenever I can finally get there in real life instead of just on little YouTube videos. But I think that as you look around, which cities have actually used the opportunity to make a different choice consciously?
Yes, well, let me just paraphrase this by firstly saying, I think that what the pandemic has done is to induce a great cycle of urban reforms. And I think the cities that have really recognized that translating, as it were, short-term agility and resilience into medium to longer term reform agendas are the ones that are really taking something positive from all of this. So you've already mentioned Paris, which I think is absolutely right. Paris is doing some fantastic things in terms of making the city more livable. I happen to be a bit of a skeptic about the proposition of the 15-minute city, and we can come back to that if people would be interested, because everybody else seems to think it's a brand new idea. Actually, I think Australian cities have been into this for a lot longer than Paris has, and we might comment on that. But other cities that are doing well out of this, well, clearly, what's happened in both Seoul and Tokyo is that the cities have started to recognize that the polycentricity that they created, you know, over the last 2 decades has begun to stand them in good stead. Very distinctive neighborhoods doing very particular things, high capacity public transport, really integrating health screening and health management into big systems, working very well. Places like Dubai have actually used the pandemic to introduce a completely new way of thinking about land use. So the Dubai 2040 plan, very interesting plan, creating an urban growth boundary for the first time, massive push on public transport, you know, and Dubai is a very car dependent city. The creation of 5 centers rather than 1 center, I think that's been extremely interesting. We've seen, I think, all of the Scandinavian cities doing what you would expect them to do, which is really opening up the whole city for the whole population, and somehow in a very cold climate, making a more civic, a more public city really work. And at the same time, obviously, cities like Singapore, I've already mentioned Dubai, Tel Aviv would be another. Cities in hot climates actually figuring out how to make walking and cycling work in an environment which might have been thought to be intolerable. So I think these are some of the cities. In the US, by the way, I think many second tier or medium-sized cities are going to benefit from this because they're going to use a kind of a livability function to really make this work. But a lot of the innovations that are happening at the urban level have been somehow occluded by bigger agendas, particularly the politics in America over the last year and a half or so. I don't need to rehearse what that's been, but also that the really important debate that's going on there about social inequality as a result. So America has a new deal to make with itself before I think we're going to see some of these urban innovations. But that's some of the cities I think have done interesting things.
Greg, this year's benchmarking report opens with an essay that that Greg talked about the relationship between city and nation. Yeah. And those of us who are urbanists can get very excited about this idea of city-states as a recurrent theme in history and a way of thinking about geography, and of course this benchmarking report is comparing cities, global cities, but it's clear on issues like COVID management and climate change that Sydney, as much as it would like to, cannot separate its reputation from the reputation of Australia. And that's certainly true about legal and financial systems and property rights regimes and all kinds of things that affect what a city is like. So we really tried to interrogate that. What is the degree of independence a global city can have? What does the relationship look like? So there's a lot to this. It's complicated. Maybe talking about climate as a way into this. You know, as a Californian, I'm very used to the idea that a state will go the opposite direction of the rest of the country on climate change. And in fact, I see many similarities between New South Wales and California. In that New South Wales is trying pretty hard to take action on climate. And even though it's the same political party, it looks really different. I reckon the rest of the world may not realize that's happening because it's just so hard to get out from under the shadow of what Australia is doing. Anyway, I know you were at the recent climate summit. What is Australia's reputation looking like these days, and what does that mean for Sydney?
Well, it's such a good question, Gabe, and I think that the report and the way it's written and the treatment of this, which I'd expect nothing less from Tim and yourselves, is very, 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 very clear, very, very good. So it's been absolutely clear for the last 20 years. Again, I've been a skeptic about this idea of a sort of league of city-states emerging, because the problem is that in the 20th and the 21st century, every city exists within a nation state, right? And you only have to look at the recent history of Hong Kong to be very clear about that. And, you know, there are very few cities that are actually city-states. Probably, you know, Singapore. In this case, we would say Singapore. And, you know, we might make an argument that Taipei is a significant part of Taiwan and all of that. But so every city exists within the confines of a nation state. The difference, of course, between Australia and America is, you know, a circa 30 million population versus circa 350 million population. So it is easier for California to differentiate itself from the USA by adopting a certain set of policies and having a particular orientation. It's much harder for an Australian state or city to do that because the country has a smaller population. The Australian federal government has more, I think, influence on some of the things, and the report correctly says that, you know, Australia's reputation on climate, on infrastructure, and on innovation policy is three areas where federal policy, as it were, is not helping Sydney, and I think that's probably right. I think that the world witnessed the tragic fires over the last year and a half, as well as, you know, the way in which Australia has been reported in the global media has tended to focus on the precarious nature of the climate challenge in Australia, and it hasn't articulated the sort of the commitment of Australia's government in this space. So if you like, there's clearly a series of question marks there, and there's some gaps. So even if the Mayor of Sydney or the Greater Sydney Commission or the New South Wales government has the most progressive policies around climate change, they're still doing it within a context of Australia, and that has an effect. Now, of course, it's not all negative. Australia has an amazing brand and reputation for lifestyle, for entrepreneurship, for culture, for diversity, and all of that benefits Sydney as well. So this isn't just a one-sided equation. But I think it's very clear that cities are increasingly being measured on the things where the Australian government is perceived to be less of a leader. And so the problem that you've got is that there's always a balance sheet between a city and a nation state. But in this case, the things where Australia may be perceived comparatively to be in deficit are the very things that cities are now being judged on. And that is Sydney's challenge.
You know, to contrasting New South Wales and California, we're at a moment where America is in this, excuse me if you think this is hyperbole, but I'll just say it, in pre-Civil War conditions. And whenever there is a Republican holding the presidency, people in California talk openly and longingly about seceding from the Union. And it's certainly imaginable, even though nobody thinks that's actually going to happen. It's such a sense of difference. That's not how it is here. And there's Australia is so much more wonderfully intact and functional than, so for me, the contrast, it can be, I can just be so grateful for the Australian framework of Medicare and, Commonwealth rent assistance, which works way better than the equivalent in America, on and on and on. Climate is where it's really hard to see how Sydney or New South Wales gets out from under the reputation of Australia as being a country that's not trying to be a leader on climate. Do you think it's worth New South Wales trying to establish a distinctive global reputation on the climate, or is that just impossible and we should just do the best we can do?
Well, I think it's already happening, actually, Gabe, and I would really encourage you to pursue it. As Tim said, the reputation is really improving on public transport. You've got a way to go on multimodal transport and getting people to use different ways of traveling to reduce the lock-in or the dependency on the internal combustion engine. That's a really good idea. Your demographics point in that direction. You should be really pursuing that. Active travel and public transport, absolutely. Secondly, you have some of the best property companies in the world are Australian property companies, and their ability to decarbonize the big buildings, and for the financial system to really help with decarbonizing homes and dwellings. That seems to me to be really clear and possible. And given the technology prowess that's emerging and your great strengths in what I would call earth sciences, there's no reason why Australia and New South Wales can't be a leader in all sorts of kinds of renewable energy. So I think the thing is to get on with the things that are practical and become famous for doing things that make a practical difference, rather than worrying about the policy climate. The policy climate may not be terribly favorable, but there are all sorts of other ways in which Australia has everything it needs and New South Wales has everything it needs to chart its own course. So yeah. I would be getting on with the practical stuff, and I think that's the way to do it. People love Sydney, right? They love New South Wales. They love Greater Sydney. They want Greater Sydney to be a winner. Greater Sydney holds a great affection in lots of people's hearts. And what they want to see is Sydney becoming the city it can be, which is to combine this famous quality of life, creativity, this culture, to combine that with being a city that's fit for the 21st century. Everybody wants that.
Beautiful. All right, let me ask a couple of questions have come in to me that are a little more about the actual benchmarks. So Greg, either for you or Tim, if you want to pop in. A question about from whose perspective are the benchmarks? And of course, you reviewed 800 of them. Hi, Tim. And it's interesting. Some of them are from the perspective of locals. Some are from the perspective of visitors or expats. But even on the same issue, this question of perspective is so interesting. If we can use a phrase like a quote unquote strong property market, which can really mean completely unaffordable housing, which is terrible if you need housing, but it will have this phrasing attached to it of a strong property market. So again, it depends on what perspective we're taking. How do you sort through all of that and try to draw a coherent storyline when the benchmarks are from so many different perspectives?
Well, Gabe, if I jump in there, it's a great question, and I think that's something we've learned to do over many years, to unpick carefully not only the data but also the assumptions behind the data. The broad story I would observe is that, more on balance, if we were looking at this 8 to 10 years ago, the majority of the indexes that look at sentiment were really, primarily surveying those whose appetite was purely for growth and for opportunity. And in that sense, it was weighted strongly towards mobile investment, towards expats, perhaps in particular sorts of corporate sectors that were global. And certainly for perhaps transactional visiting. I do think, though, that on balance over the last 5 to 10 years, partly because of the ability to survey many more people of a broader base of population, not only those who are in sort of certain kinds of global corporate networks, but actually residents are surveyed much better than they used to be. People who are looking to get a foot on the property ladder are now consulted much more. And those who are interested in the issues we're talking about today, climate change, placemaking, the sort of extent to which a city's sort of fabric is held together. Those things are much more part of the equation, and we look to observe that all the time. And I think it's actually becoming more healthy that is now the case, and it tends to mean that some cities are rising up the ranks because they perform better in those areas than they do in the former. And others are falling back because they are seen primarily as gateways for certain activities and at the expense of others. And I think that's partly motivating a lot more cities to develop an inclusive growth or broad-based growth agenda that is more holistic. And to the extent that benchmarks can support that, then all the better.
Greg, any comments on that? Well, I think Tim's got it absolutely right, and he is the world expert on this subject. So I'm not gonna say anything different to him. But I would say that in the past, these benchmarks were serving, if you like, the footloose, who had a decision to make about whether to locate a firm in X city or Y city, or whether to take 100 expats to X city or Y city, or whether to send their daughter or their son to university in X city or Y city. And as Tim says very correctly, they're now focusing much more on citizen sentiment. And I think that's very important. And the way I would put it to you is this, that in the very long run, the only really good measure of city success is population growth and population satisfaction, population stability. That's a 50-year measure. How has population changed? Within business cycles, and of course in Australia you had a very long business cycle, then these other kinds of measures really are very important. Things to do with, the rate of investment in infrastructure, or overall, the level of R&D and all of that. But actually, if you want to capture what's really making a difference, it's the ability of cities to service a population. And the thing is, successful cities grow their population. Very successful cities learn how to service a bigger population than they used to have. And it seems to me that that's the key issue that Tim's really getting at here. But let's take one example of livability. So as Tim, I think, will tell you, 20 years ago, all the measures of livability were to do with what expats care about. International schools, quality of restaurants, numbers of orchestras, size of back gardens. In other words, it was all about elite amenities or private amenities. Measures of livability today measure all sorts of things to do with air quality, to do with public health, to do with the base performance of the public school system. So it's much more about shared amenities. And that's the shift that's taken place. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, that's so many great quotes coming out of today, but really successful cities figure out how to service a bigger population than they used to have. It's quite profound. Of course, if your city is a great place, people will want to come. And whether you are capable of metabolizing that, of welcoming people in, which is partly an economic question, partly a cultural question, partly an infrastructure and planning question, and being able to put that all together that's what it really looks like to be a high-performing city, isn't it?
That's right. And maybe one obvious thing to say, Gabe, is that if you look at Australian cities in general, and Sydney in particular, this is the story of the last 20 years, right? That the world discovered the amazing quality of life, the fantastic people, the great culture, the great diversity, the great cosmopolitan mix and flow of Australian cities. As a consequence, the populations grew. Now, the chickens are coming home to roost. And the question is, can Australian cities increase what we would call their carrying capacity to meet the needs of this growth population? And that's really the story of Sydney in the last 10 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
All of the investment that's got into infrastructure, the Metropolis of Three Cities plan, the creation of metropolitan governance that works, the combination of New South Wales state with local government, the role that intelligent, civic-minded businesses have played through the Committee for Sydney. It's all been about adjusting the carrying capacity to the additional load that was created by the attractiveness that brought more population. So that's the equation we're in.
Right. And the extraordinary success story of building this new metro network, you realize, is not just about an improvement to quality of life so you don't have to sit in your car, but it's the armature to organize the future growth of Sydney, because you should put as much as possible, you should cluster the growth within walking distance of those rail stations. And so as Sydney builds that out, it has the capacity to function well as a bigger place.
I think that's right. And just to bring it back to the climate change point, the work of the Coalition for Urban Transitions, I think it's really clear here. What they've said is, if you really want a net zero city, it's got to be firstly really well connected. And that means all the public transport you've just been talking about, but the digital connectivity as well. Mm-hmm. It's got to be a compact city. It's got to be frugal with its land. It's got to have that workable, medium density, high amenity kind of environment. And it's got to be clean. You've got to clean your energy systems, your water systems, your waste systems, your built environment. And those three ideas, clean, connected, and compact, have to be underpinned by electrification, by circularity. They have to be underpinned by land use reforms, and they have to be underpinned and supported by citizen behavior changes, and by some notion that the transition that's going on is just or fair somehow.
Yeah, wow, there's a lot in that.
Yeah.
And really of those, where Sydney falls down the most is on compactness. It is not compact, and it is struggling to turn the corner to stop spreading outward and not make that problem worse than it already is. An interesting issue. Let me read a question that's come in from Ed Steen at the Greater Sydney Commission.
Great.
Tim, this is probably to you. How can we reconcile the trajectories for the talent and labor market metric with the wages and costs metric? Is it surprising that they are not moving in the same direction, given the relationship between the two?
Well, that's a great question.
That may need a little unpacking, but obviously Ed was a careful reader of the slides you showed.
That's right. And every question from Ed is always a good question. And in this case, you know, I think it is, of course, when you're aggregating these things, one is sometimes observing that performance can be operating in one direction, but perception sometimes can be operating in another. As I mentioned, wages and costs, that's something that, you know, as we were alluding to just now, used to just be about measuring purchasing power, perhaps for those who were on a one-year secondment type arrangement. Now it's much more to do with how do those who are living for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, for their whole lifetime, students who are there for 3 to 4 years, and others, how do they perceive this city to be in terms of access to good housing, good quality goods and other amenity for good value for money. So the wages and costs are very much led by much more robust perception measures than they used to be. The talent flows are more cyclical, as I mentioned, partly a repatriation of talent that we've seen. Sydney's benefited a little bit more than other cities from that shift. And also the fact that talent measures do tend to look quite a lot at the attainment end of the spectrum, which I think is more about, you know, the production line of degrees and qualifications and credentials that I think Sydney and Greater Sydney is so successful at really optimizing. It doesn't look as much at those issues that we would observe to be very important, the extent to which, as one moves through one's career, one feels that Sydney is the location for all stages of that journey, and that's partly a product of just tracking these things has proven difficult, particularly during COVID. So there are those reasons that would explain it, and I think that in general we're seeing that cities, the leading cities, whether we're talking about New York and London and Paris, or whether we're talking about Tokyo, Singapore, Sydney for that matter, they're all experiencing a little bit of a challenge where actually the affordability equation is eroding a lot of the perception measures in this space, even Amsterdam, in fact. And there is an issue around how does one sustain the right talent pipeline? Are there, in Amsterdam's case, opportunities to, in a certain sense, activate other nearby cities to be locations for talent to come in, live in one city and work in another? That's Amsterdam's solution. We're seeing that in more European cities where larger cities are nearby, perhaps within 60 minutes travel time. A little bit more challenging in an Australian context, but other solutions are coming, I think, with the rise of new CBDs and centres.
It's interesting. You may know that yesterday it was announced that the Greater Sydney Commission's remit is being expanded to include Newcastle and Wollongong and the Central Coast. So a metropolis of 6 cities, as very much a reflection of this emerging mega region geography that we see all over the world, where cities that are in the 1 to 2 hour away orbit are being pulled together, driven by affordability, perhaps driven by different lifestyle preferences, enabled by upgraded transport infrastructure. So that will be the big question for us here. But this question of affordability, it really is the essence of the problem for some of the world's great cities, isn't it? Now, they're so great, but only if you have the money to afford to be there. How does that show up in the benchmarking report?
Well, I will invite Greg to respond in a moment, but I would say in a way, it affects almost every element of every category, because there are so many areas where the externalities associated with a lack of affordability are really affecting whether cities, including Sydney, are able to accommodate the kind of talent that they want. The creative and cultural mix that they often seek, it can often be challenging, and we see deficits in that area too. So no doubt that there is a profound challenge that, you know, as we all have discussed many times, requires a housing solution, but it also requires a mega region, as you mentioned, solution. And I think it also requires a whole set of policies around densification and transport, now using the real advantage of this new infrastructure development. That's what Greater Paris is doing right now. Greater Paris is probably the only region akin to Sydney in terms of its creation of such a large scale of new metropolitan infrastructure. And they are going very hard at the unlocking almost around every station, not just greater density, but much higher quality collaborative placemaking involving all partners and private sector stepping up. So I think the solutions are out there if we look around and try to work hard and experiment and then amplify those that we find. But you're right, it is there, and it's I think it will be, with climate change, the defining challenge of the next 5 or 10 years for many cities.
Greg, maybe we turn this into an opportunity for a couple of minutes of closing comments from you. I know we're near the end of time here.
Well, to pick up on this issue, I think that Tim's right and you're right to raise it, Gabe. I think affordability of housing is going to be one of the ways that we'll judge whether those really successful cities have been able to accommodate the population growth that they've attracted, coming back to the earlier point. And the reason this is complicated is because, as Tim says, there are external dimensions of this as well as internal ones. So the external dimensions are all to do with globalization, global capital markets, what we might call the commodification of housing or the assetization of housing, where, in other ways, it's been very good to see international capital coming into residential real estate in our most prosperous cities, but not if it has the effect of, as it were, taking housing out of the accessibility of the local labor force. Because if you do that, there's a big drag on labor productivity because of where people have to live. So this is the big problem. There are internal dimensions to this as well. It's to do with planning regimes. It's to do with real estate, housing developers and the way they behave necessarily, to deliver their business. But it's also to do with technologies. It's to do with manufacturing, and it's to do with the large amounts of land that exist in every city that are kind of suboptimally used as well. So you've got internal and external problems. And this is where the pandemic, I think, is very interesting, because the pandemic creates a new relationship between labor markets and housing markets in such a way that you can, in what you've called a mega region, Gabe, you can begin to unlock more locations in which it's possible for a labor force to live while still occupying a job that's further away than the previous daily commute would allow. Now, this might happen for 10% or 20% of the population, but if it does, it has very important sequential effects. So let's be really clear about this. If the links between Newcastle and Sydney and the duration of that journey and the quality of that journey improve to the point where 5 to 10% of people who used to live and work in Sydney end up living in Newcastle but working in Sydney, then the first order effect will be that housing is more affordable for those workers. They'll be able to work in a hybrid way, in a blended way, and that will work very well. But the second order effect is that Newcastle becomes a bigger hub of talent. And as a consequence, many more of those people will start to generate more jobs in Newcastle, and many of them will start to establish their own businesses there. Corporates will move there. You'll end up with a more polycentric region through the second order and then the third order effects. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think that will alleviate pressure on Sydney. It will also, of course, be good for Western Sydney. It will be good for Parramatta, and it will be good for, a metropolis of 6 cities will work really well if the infrastructure investment, both in terms of transport and digitization, is there. And if those 6 cities each have a sense of what they're really good at, and as it were, they play to their strengths, and then they play to their complementarities. So in that respect, I think there's an accidental opportunity here to do something that could be, I think, in the long term, very important for Sydney and for its neighbours.
All right, perfect words to close on. And we sure appreciate that you pay such close attention to Sydney as you both scan all the cities of the world. It is really wonderful how you track what's happening here and help us be in dialogue with other cities. So everybody, this benchmarking report will be up on our website. We'll also be emailing it out. It's really worth a careful read. Tim, thank you for all the work on the report. Greg, thank you for joining. I'll close by just acknowledging the Innovation Fund partners that support the core research program of the Committee for Sydney, including the benchmarking report, and you can see them all there. Couldn't do it without you. All right, everybody. This may be, I think, our last public event like this for the year. I might be wrong, but I think it is. Our last webinar. So if that's right, we'll see you on the other side.